The mountains had no mercy. They rose from the Virginia darkness like broken teeth, jagged and black against a sky that offered nothing. No moon, no stars, only the cold pressing down from above and the colder stone pressing up from below. Somewhere in that darkness, men were dying. Captain Garrett Rourke pressed his back against a boulder that had probably stood there since before America was a country. The radio crackled against his jaw. The voice on the other end was calm, the way only truly bad news is calm. Flat, final, carrying the weight of something that couldn't be undone. Negative on air support, Tiger Team. Weather system moving in from the northwest. All flight operations suspended until 0600. You are on your own until dawn. 7 hours. Rourke closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. That was all he allowed himself. 24 men were counting on whatever lived behind those eyes when he opened them again. He was 56 years old. He had survived Desert Storm. He had survived 3 deployments to places that didn't officially exist, doing things that would never appear in any file with his name on it. He had buried friends in flag-draped boxes and stood at the gravesides of men who were better than him and never once doubted that the work was worth doing. But this felt different. 200 hostiles held the ridge lines above. The enemy had known exactly where to wait. Every position, every approach route, every contingency plan, compromised. This wasn't an ambush. Ambushes were accidents of timing. This was something built over months, something that required information from inside, something that had a name behind it that Rourke was not yet ready to say out loud. "Hold positions," he said into the radio. His voice came out steady. "Conserve ammunition. We dig in until dawn." 20 yards to his left, Lieutenant Declan Merritt, 35 years old, sharp as a blade, the kind of officer who aged 10 years in the field and 10 years more trying to forget what he'd seen, pressed himself into a crack in the rock and met Rourke's eyes across the darkness. No words passed between them. After enough years, men who have fought together don't need words for the simple things. The simple things are always the worst ones anyway. Then it came, a single shot from the eastern ridge. One crack, clean and precise, cutting through the chaos the way a knife cuts through water, barely disturbing it, leaving almost nothing behind except the sudden silence where a threat used to be. The heavy machine gun that had been pinning down Rourke's alpha element for the better part of 20 minutes simply stopped. Its operator slumped forward over the barrel. Through his night vision, Rourke could see the man's helmet and nothing else. And the nothing else was enough. 3 seconds passed. A second shot. An RPG carrier on the northern ridge spun backward, as if shoved by an invisible hand, his warhead detonating against bare rock in a useless orange flower that lit the valley for half a heartbeat and then was gone. A third shot. A spotter dropped. Rourke scanned the eastern ridge through his night vision. He scanned it twice. He saw nothing. No muzzle flash. No movement. No silhouette against the sky. Whoever was up there had found a position so clean that the mountain itself seemed to be doing the shooting. His radio crackled on a frequency that wasn't in the mission briefing. "Sierra Whiskey to Tiger Team." A woman's voice. Calm. Focused. Carrying absolutely no interest in the fact that 200 armed men were trying very hard to kill everyone in this valley. "Move northeast toward the ravine. You'll have cover." Rourke recognized the voice. He sat with that recognition for a moment. The way you sit with something impossible, not denying it, not accepting it, just holding it at arm's length while the world continues to fall apart around you. Then he said, "Move." 6 months earlier, Dam Neck, Virginia, the briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Development Group smelled of coffee and ambition and the particular tension that fills any room where serious men are about to be told something they don't want to hear. The fluorescent lights were the unforgiving kind. They showed everything. Rourke was already there when Colonel Victor Harlan walked in. Harlan was 67 years old and moved like a man who had decided decades ago that gravity was a suggestion. His hair had gone the color of a February sky. Not white, not gray, but that specific shade between the two that certain men reach when they have seen too much and process most of it without flinching. His face was a map of every hard thing he had ever done. His eyes were the color of glacial ice and moved with the same unhurried certainty, taking in the room the way a surveyor takes in land, measuring, calculating, filing. He had served in the Cold War's darkest corridors, Panama, Grenada, the kind of operations that never made it into history books because the history books were written for people who needed to sleep at night. He was, by any honest accounting, one of the most effective intelligence architects the United States government had ever produced. He was also the last man on Earth Rourke wanted to see walking through that door. The woman came in behind him. She was in her late 20s, blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun that suggested discipline rather than fashion. Blue eyes so pale they were almost colorless, carrying an expression that had been trained to reveal absolutely nothing. Her posture was military perfect, not the studied perfection of someone trying to look military, but the natural alignment of someone who had been told often enough that their body was a tool and had believed it deeply enough for it to become true. She wore standard-issue BDUs, no insignia beyond the flag on her shoulder. She looked to 24 experienced operators who had spent their careers reading people in milliseconds, like someone who had dressed the part without having lived it. The nickname was born before Harlan finished his second sentence. "Gentlemen," Harlan said, his voice carrying the comfortable authority of a man who had never needed to raise it, "this is Maya Callaway. She will serve as your communications specialist for Operation Crossfire." Rourke was on his feet before he had made a conscious decision to stand. 15 years of commanding SEAL teams had given him a very specific relationship with his own instincts, and every one of them was sending the same message right now. "With respect, Colonel," he kept his voice level. "That took effort. My team is fully staffed. We've been training together for 6 months. This deployment has specific demands that require—" "I'm aware of what your deployment requires, Captain." Harlan's eyes settled on Rourke the way a piece of heavy equipment settles onto ground, without hurry, without doubt, with absolute finality. "Ms. Callaway comes with qualifications your mission requires. She's fluent in Russian. She holds an Olympic gold medal in precision shooting. She graduated top of her class at Quantico. She will be an asset." Rourke looked at the woman. She looked back at him. She did not shift her weight. She did not look at the floor. She stood there and took his assessment the way a good operator takes incoming fire, by not flinching and by calculating her response. "This is a combat unit," Rourke said, "not a classroom." "I'm well aware of what it is," Harlan replied. "I was commanding teams like this when you were still in BUD/S." The room temperature dropped. Every man present felt it. Maya Callaway stepped forward exactly 1 pace, just enough to enter the conversation without pushing into it. "Captain Rourke," she said. Her voice was measured, not soft, not aggressive. Measured, the way a marksman measures wind before committing to a shot. "I'm not here to disrupt your unit. I'm here because I have skills this mission requires." Rourke studied her for another 3 seconds. Then he said, "Training starts at 0500. Don't be late." She was there at 0445. By nightfall, the entire unit was calling her porcelain. The obstacle course at dawn was the kind that had been specifically designed to break men who were already very hard to break. The wall, the pit, the weaver, the rope climb. Each station built not to test physical capacity, but to find the precise place where physical capacity ended and something else had to take over, or didn't. Maya ran the course. She wasn't the fastest, she wasn't the strongest. What she was methodical. She moved through each obstacle with an economy of motion that spoke of calculation rather than effort, as though she had already run this course in her mind several times and was now simply executing the plan. The mud pit left her uniform heavy and dark. The rope climb left her palms raw. She kept going. It was the rifle qualification that changed the weather in the room. The course was a standard stress shooting exercise. Run 400 meters, drop into position, engage targets at distances from 100 to 800 yards, with the clock running and the pressure building. The other men shot well. They were among the best trained marksmen in the world, and it showed. Maya stepped to the line. The whistle blew. She ran. She dropped. Her hands settled into position with a kind of certainty that isn't taught, the kind that lives deeper than muscle memory, in some place where the body and the weapon have stopped being separate things. She began to fire. Each shot was a single, deliberate, irrevocable fact. No wasted motion, no adjustment between shots. Each target received exactly one round, placed exactly where it would do the most necessary work. At 800 yards, at 4 in the morning, running on 3 hours of sleep after an obstacle course that had worn down men twice her size, she put them all down. Perfect score. Record time. The range was very quiet. Rourke raised his binoculars and checked her targets for a long time. Then he lowered them. Again, he said. She ran it again. Same result. I have never seen shooting like that. Merritt stood to Rourke's left, speaking in a voice slightly lower than he probably intended. Not even from you, Captain. Rourke's jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a man recalibrating something he thought he understood. He watched Maya clear her weapon and step back from the line with the quiet economy of someone who had just done an ordinary thing. She can shoot paper, he said. The field is different. He was right. The stress course, live fire, smoke, strobe lights, blank rounds going off beside the shooter's head, targets appearing and vanishing in fractions of a second, brought Maya down to 60%. The chaos broke her timing. The sensory overload fractured the precision that had looked so absolute on the flat range. That's the gap between the range and reality, Rourke told her, standing at the end of the course while she was still breathing hard. There was no cruelty in his voice. It was the voice of a man who has paid for what he knows and believes the information is worth passing on. Olympic training gives you the foundation, but out there everything is noise. Everything is wrong, and you still have to shoot straight. Maya looked at him. I'll work on it. See that you do. He turned to leave, then stopped. The stopping was the kind that looks like an afterthought, but isn't. Your father never missed, he said, not even under stress. He walked away before she could respond. The nights at Dam Neck were long, and Maya used most of them. She had been given access to the stress course after hours. No official record, no observers. She worked it alone in the dark, failing and adjusting, and failing differently, and adjusting again, the way serious people work at serious problems. The gap closed slowly, not all the way, but slowly. One night, coming back late from the range, she saw him. Rourke stood at the far end of the memorial wall, where the names of SEAL operators killed in action were inscribed on simple metal plaques. The wall was not dramatic. It did not try to be moving. It was just a list of names on metal, and the weight of it came from understanding what each name had cost. Rourke's back was to her, his right hand raised, one finger resting on a name. She would have turned away. In another life, she would have respected the privacy of whatever was happening in that posture and gone back to her quarters without a word. Instead, she walked toward him. He sensed her before she was close. 20 years of operating in the dark had turned that kind of awareness into something that functioned below thought. Late Wells, he said. He had used her father's name. He caught it immediately. Callaway. I was at the range, she said. I know. She looked at the plaque his finger was resting on. Marcus Harlan. She knew the name. Harlan had mentioned it once, in passing, with the specific casualness of someone making sure the mention registered without appearing to try. Harlan's son, she said. Rourke was quiet for a long time. The sound of the Atlantic came through the darkness. waves breaking somewhere they couldn't see. 1989, he said finally. Mexico City. We were a five-man team. Harlan was commanding. His son Marcus was point. He paused. The pause held things that had probably never been said out loud. The intelligence was bad. We walked into a prepared position. Marcus took a hit, critical but survivable with immediate evacuation. Harlan made the call to continue the mission. Said the intelligence documents we were after had changed the parameters. Maya waited. I refused, Rourke said. Told him I wasn't leaving Marcus to bleed out. Harlan threatened court-martial. While we were arguing, the enemy repositioned. Another pause. Marcus bled out before we could reach him. Harlan got his intelligence, got a commendation for it. He finally turned to look at her. His face in the darkness was the face of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has made peace with the weight without ever making peace with the reason. That is who put you on this team, he said. A man who will sacrifice anything, including his own blood, when he decides the mission requires it. You need to understand that. Whatever he told you about why you're here, that's the context it lives inside. Maya absorbed this. She thought about Harlan's hands, which she had never seen shake. She thought about the way he looked at her sometimes, not like a commanding officer looks at an asset, but like something else, something harder to name. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because your father told me something in Somalia, the night before his last deployment. Rourke's voice was different now, quieter, carrying a register of a thing remembered rather than told. He said, whatever happens, never leave your team behind. The mission matters, but the people are everything. A beat. He meant it. I watched him mean it. He stepped back from the wall. The conversation was over in the way that certain conversations end, not because everything has been said, but because everything necessary has been said, and more words would only dilute it. Get some rest, Callaway. Harlan found her at the range before dawn. She was working a 600-yard target, adjusting for a crosswind that had shifted twice in the last 20 minutes. The rounds were landing in a group tight enough to cover with a playing card. She heard him come up behind her and did not stop shooting. Your father would be proud, he said. She lowered the rifle, turned, looked at him with the pale eyes that were, he had always thought, exactly her father's eyes, not in color but in quality, in the particular way they received information without announcing what they were doing with it. Tell me about Somalia, she said. He was quiet for a moment. In 67 years of hard work in dark places, Victor Harlan had learned that the moments when you most want to deflect are often the moments when deflecting costs the most. He moved to stand beside her, looking downrange at the target she'd been working. October 1993, he said. Operation Watchbreaker. Your father led a four-man team. The objective was Nikolai Breskov, former KGB Department 12, the division that handled nuclear intelligence and acquisition. After the Soviet collapse, Breskov had gone independent. He was brokering the sale of portable nuclear devices to anyone willing to pay. We had tracked him to Mogadishu. Your father had the shot. Maya was very still. Clean shot, Harlan continued. 720 yards. Wind from the northwest at 8 knots. Your father had made harder shots before breakfast. But Breskov had prepared for the possibility. The entire meeting site was wired, explosives connected to a dead man's mechanism. If Breskov died, everyone in that building died with him, including 3 members of your father's team who were positioned inside. The wind moved through the range. Neither of them moved with it. Frank lowered his rifle, Harlan said. The words cost him something visible. Not much. He had spent decades learning to spend these things carefully, but something. He warned his team on the radio instead of taking the shot. The transmission exposed his position. Breskov's security found him in 4 seconds. He stopped. Your father provided covering fire until his team was clear. He was hit twice before they reached safety. He died before the extraction reached him. Maya's hands were at her sides. Her breathing was controlled. Everything about her exterior was controlled. What lived underneath the control was a different matter, and Harlan, who had known her since she was a child who collected shell casings instead of dolls, did not pretend not to know what it was. He chose his men over the mission, she said. He chose 3 men over 8 million. Harlan's voice did not waver, but something at the edge of it, something that had no business being in the voice of a man like Victor Harlan, almost did. Breskov disappeared. For 15 years, he moved through the black markets of the former Soviet world, Iran, North Korea, the Pakistani frontier, selling expertise, selling access, working towards something we couldn't fully identify until 3 months ago. He finally turned to look at her. His eyes, up close, were not as cold as they appeared from a distance. They were simply very tired. We have intelligence confirming that Breskov has obtained the last unaccounted for Soviet portable nuclear device, an RA-115. He is planning its transfer to a non-state actor for deployment on American soil. Manhattan. We believe the timeline is within the next 90 days. The morning light was beginning to find the edges of the tree line. Operation Crossfire is not a hostage rescue, Harlan said. The communications specialist role is a cover. Your real purpose will depend on how the mission develops. He looked at her steadily, not the way a commanding officer looks at an asset, but the way a man looks at something he has spent a very long time trying to protect and is now placing in front of something dangerous because he has run out of other options. I need someone I trust absolutely, someone with your particular skills, someone who understands that sometimes the hardest choice is the right one. Like leaving my father behind, Maya said. The words landed between them. Harlan received them without flinching. I was Frank's commanding officer. I was his closest friend. Each word was placed carefully, like weight on ice. I attended every one of your birthdays until you were 12. I stood at your mother's door in dress uniform and told her what happened to her husband. I have carried what your father decided in that building in Mogadishu for 15 years. He straightened. The tiredness did not leave his eyes, but it organized itself back into something more familiar. I am not asking you to forgive the mathematics. I am asking you to help me make the mathematics mean something. She turned back to her target, raised the rifle, found the crosswind, fired, center mass, exactly. Training at 0500, she said. He walked away. She kept shooting. That evening, going through her gear for the deployment, Maya found it. She almost missed it. It was packed beneath the communications equipment she had been officially issued, wrapped in a standard equipment cloth, no label, no paperwork. She unwrapped it with the careful hands of someone who already knew what they were going to find. The Barrett M82A1 was cold from storage. The optics were clean and properly zeroed. She could tell from the adjustment positions without even looking through the scope. The ammunition was armor-piercing, match-grade, the kind that cost considerably more than a communications specialist had any reason to be carrying. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Harlan walking away from the range that morning. She thought about the way he had not looked surprised when she shot perfect scores. She thought about a 67-year-old man standing in a room in Langley, Virginia, watching a blinking dot on a screen that represented the last thing his closest friend had left in the world. She thought about her father's hands on a rifle in a wired building in Mogadishu, pointing at a man who would go on to threaten 8 million people in the city her father's daughter lived 30 minutes away from. She thought about what it meant to choose. Maya Callaway picked up the Barrett. She checked the action. She checked the feed. She checked the zero. She verified the ammunition count. Her hands moved through each step with the same unhurried precision her father had taught her on Virginia ranges on weekend mornings, when the air was cold and the coffee was hot, and the world felt like something that could be understood. She set the rifle down. She sat with it in the silence of her quarters and let the weight of everything she now knew settle into its proper place. Then she began to pack. Outside the window, The last light was leaving the Virginia sky, and the Appalachian Mountains to the west were becoming the dark shapes they always became at nightfall. Not threatening exactly, but reminding anyone who looked at them that the world contained large things that did not concern themselves with human plans. In 6 months, she would be climbing one of those mountains alone in the dark, with a rifle she was not officially carrying, trying to save men who had called her porcelain. She did not know that yet, but somewhere in her body, in the place where training and inheritance and the weight of a father's last decision all lived together, she was already getting ready. Porcelain. They had no idea what she was made of. The mission briefing happened at 2200 hours on a Tuesday in September, and it was the kind of briefing that sounds clean on paper. Rourke stood at the front of the room and walked his team through it the way he had walked teams through 100 briefings before. Methodically, without drama, covering terrain and timing and contingencies with the focused economy of a man who understood that the space between a good briefing and a bad one was often measured in body bags. The maps on the wall showed the Appalachian terrain in the kind of detail that suggested serious preparation. The intelligence reports were thorough. The objective was clear: extract a nuclear physicist. Dr. Raymond Forsyth, 41 years old, dark hair, American-born, reportedly held against his will at a remote compound in the Blue Ridge Range, taken 3 weeks ago. Intelligence suggested a window of approximately 8 hours before he would be moved again. It sounded clean. Rourke had been doing this long enough to know that clean-sounding things deserved the most scrutiny. He had spent the 2 days before the briefing going back through the intelligence files with the patient, methodical attention of a man who distrusts comfort. He had found things that bothered him: small inconsistencies in the source reporting, gaps in the surveillance timeline, a pattern of confirmation that felt too tidy, like a story that had been constructed rather than discovered. He had taken his concerns to Harlan. Harlan had listened with the careful attention of a man who already knew everything being said to him. He had nodded at the appropriate moments. He had explained each inconsistency with a smoothness that should have been reassuring, and instead felt like watching someone handle a question they had rehearsed. "The intelligence is solid, Garrett," Harlan had said. "The window is closing. We move as planned." Rourke had looked at him for a moment. He had thought about Marcus Harlan's name on a wall at Dam Neck. He had thought about a 5-man team in Mexico City in 1989 and a commanding officer who had made his calculations and lived with them for 35 years. He had gone back to his team and said nothing, but he had found a moment with Maya before the briefing dispersed. She was reviewing the communications equipment, primary systems, backup systems, encrypted frequencies, with the methodical attention she brought to everything. He came up beside her and spoke quietly, not looking at her directly, his eyes on the map. "When we're out there," he said, "if standard comms fail, use this." He pressed a small device into her hand, compact, encrypted, outside the mission's official communication architecture. "Direct line to me, bypasses everything else." She looked at the device. "This isn't in the protocol. Neither is whatever Harlan is actually running." He kept his voice level. "I've been doing this a long time. I know when intelligence has been shaped rather than gathered. Something about this mission doesn't add up." He paused. "I need to know every asset I have out there, including you." Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she slipped the device into her gear. "Understood." He started to move away. "Captain," her voice stopped him. Not loud, not urgent, but carrying something that made him turn. "My father's last radio transmission before he was hit," she said. "Do you know what it was?" He looked at her. "He said his team was clear. Then he said he was going to ground." A beat. That was all. She nodded once. He walked away. At 0100, the helicopters lifted into the Virginia dark. 2 MH-60 Blackhawks, modified for reduced acoustic signature, carrying 24 of the most capable operators in the United States military. Below them, the Appalachian Mountains moved in the darkness like a slow black sea. Maya watched them from the communications station at the forward operating position, a hardened structure at the edge of the operational area, equipped with every technical asset she officially needed to support the mission. She tracked the team's progress through radio traffic. Professional, clipped, the shorthand of people who had trained together long enough to compress meaning into single words. The helicopters landed on schedule. Alpha element moved to establish perimeter. Bravo element advanced toward the target compound. Then the traffic changed. It changed the way weather changes in the mountains, not gradually, but all at once, as if the sky had been holding something back and suddenly decided not to. Contact, heavy contact. Merritt's voice on the primary frequency, stripped to bone. Multiple hostiles, all approaches. These are not irregular fighters. Repeat, these are not irregular fighters. Then Rourke's voice, carrying exactly as much alarm as a flat stone carries water, which is none. Fall back to secondary positions, defensive formation, conserve ammunition. Then the number, 50, then a correction, 100. Then the word that Maya had been half expecting since the briefing and had hoped not to hear. 200. Minimum 200, well-armed, pre-positioned. A pause of exactly the length it takes a man to look at a situation and accept what it is. They were waiting for us. Maya stood at the communications console and listened to her team walking into a prepared ambush that someone had spent months constructing. She heard Rourke request air support and heard the weather report that denied it. She heard Merritt calling in positions that were already surrounded. She heard the RPG impacts and the radio traffic cutting out and coming back and cutting out again. 7 hours until dawn. She looked at the Barrett M82A1 lying in its case beneath her communications equipment. She looked at the topographic display on her screen showing the compound's surrounding terrain. The eastern ridge ran along the compound's flank at an elevation 340 meters above the valley floor. From that elevation, with the right weapon and the right shooter, you could see everything, every approach, every position, every threat before it became a casualty. She had studied that ridge for 6 months without knowing she was studying it. She looked at the device Rourke had pressed into her hand. She looked at the comm station that would run on automated protocols for at least 40 minutes before anyone noticed the reduction in active traffic. She thought about 24 men in a valley below a ridge that nobody was watching. She picked up the Barrett. She went into the dark. The eastern ridge was not a friendly piece of terrain. It rose from the valley floor at angles that changed without warning, offering handholds that looked solid and weren't, sections of near-vertical rock face that required both hands and offered nothing for the feet, exposed stretches where the mountain simply presented itself as a wall with no apparent opinion about whether you could climb it or not. Maya climbed it. She moved in darkness, which was both a problem and an advantage. The darkness made the footing treacherous and the route finding difficult. It also made her invisible to everything below. She wore no light. She navigated by the topographic memories she had built over 6 months of studying maps she was never officially told were part of her preparation, and by the natural instinct for terrain that her father had spent years teaching her on ranges and trails throughout the Virginia countryside. Frank Callaway had believed that a sniper's most important skill was not shooting. He had told her this so many times that it had become something close to a family motto, said with the patient repetition of someone passing on information they considered genuinely important. The shooting, he would say, is the last thing. Everything before the shooting, the movement, the positioning, the reading of ground, the understanding of angles and distances, and the way light behaves at different hours. That is the actual work. If you've done everything right, the shooting is almost easy. She thought about his voice as she climbed. She found it in the space between handholds, in the moment of balance on a narrow ledge, in the controlled breathing that kept her heart rate down despite the exertion, and the cold, and the sounds coming up from the valley below. The crack of rifle fire, the deeper percussion of RPGs, the radio traffic in her earpiece painting a picture she would have preferred not to see clearly. She thought about him on this kind of ground. He had been built for it, long-limbed, patient, with the specific stillness that the mountains seemed to produce in certain men who spent enough time on them. She had his hands. She had been told this many times, by Harlan, by old friends of her father's who occasionally appeared at family gatherings and looked at her with the particular expression of people recognizing something they didn't expect to find. Her father's hands, her father's eyes, her father's rifle. She climbed. An hour and 20 minutes after leaving the forward operating position, Maya Callaway pulled herself onto a narrow outcropping near the ridge's crest, found a position behind a natural rock formation that offered concealment without fully obscuring her field of view, and looked down into the valley. What she saw was a battlefield losing its shape. 24 SEAL operators in defensive positions, surrounded and systematically pressured from 4 directions by a force that had been waiting for them with the patience of people who had known exactly what was coming and when. The enemy's positions were well chosen. High ground on 3 sides, the ravine cutting off the eastern escape route, heavy weapons covering the most defensible terrain. They were not fighting like irregular forces. They were fighting like professionals, coordinated, disciplined, maintaining pressure rather than rushing, bleeding the trap force of ammunition and options with the calm efficiency of people who understood they didn't need to hurry. She settled into position, controlled her breathing the way Frank had taught her, found the space between heartbeats. She keyed the device Rourke had given her. Sierra Whiskey to Tiger Team. Move northeast toward the ravine. You'll have cover. A long pause. She could almost hear Rourke processing the voice against the reality of where she was supposed to be. Callaway. A single word carrying everything. Affirmative. Eastern Ridge. Established. I have overwatch. She was already working the scope, cataloging threats in order of immediate lethality. Heavy machine gun position on your northern approach is priority 1. I'm on it. She did not wait for a response. The Barrett M82A1 is not a subtle weapon. It is, in the language of the people who build such things, a large caliber anti-materiel rifle, designed originally to disable vehicles and equipment, adapted over decades for the particular requirements of long-range precision shooting in the specific situations where subtlety has already failed and something more definitive is required. It fires around the size of a man's thumb at velocities that make distance a secondary concern. At 830 yards, accounting for the elevation difference and a crosswind she had been measuring since she arrived, Maya placed her first round exactly where it needed to go. The machine gun went silent. She moved, changed position by 12 yards, reset, found the next priority. On the radio, she heard Rourke's voice telling his elements to use the silence. She heard them moving. She heard Merritt coordinating the withdrawal toward the ravine position she had indicated. She kept working. She found a rhythm that was not quite like anything she had experienced before. Not the clean precision of a range, not the disoriented chaos of the stress course, but something between them, something that used both and transcended both. The valley below was not a range. The targets below were not paper, but the fundamentals held, the way her father had always said they would, the way any true thing holds when everything else around it is falling apart. Second position, third, fourth. She moved after every shot, sometimes immediately, sometimes after a brief wait, reading the response patterns of the forces below, learning how they were organized, where their communication nodes were, which eliminations created the most disruption. She was not just shooting, she was conducting, pulling apart the orchestration of the ambush piece by piece, creating space and time and options for the men in the valley who had none of those things 40 minutes ago. By the 23rd shot, she had made a significant mistake. Not in the shooting remained precise. The mistake was in the pattern. She had settled, unconsciously, into a rhythm of movement that a trained observer would eventually detect. And somewhere on the western ridge, there was a trained observer. The shot came from 400 yards away and struck the rock face 6 inches to the left of her head. Stone fragments cut her cheek. She was already rolling before the sound reached her, moving behind the outcropping, pressing flat against the cold rock with her heart doing something it hadn't done yet tonight, which was consider the possibility that things might not work out. She lay still and assessed. The shot had come from a specific angle. The shooter had chosen a position that gave him the western ridge's natural cover, while offering a clear sightline to the location she had been using. The shot had been precise, not lucky, not approximate, but precise in a way that required training of a specific kind. She had encountered this kind of precision exactly twice before, both times in controlled environments, and both times the shooter on the other end had been former military, professional, operating with equipment and technique that marked a particular lineage. Spetsnaz, Russian Special Forces. The methodical patience, the equipment signatures she had glimpsed in her scope during the valley work, she saw them now for what they were. These were not irregular forces protecting a kidnapped physicist. She thought about what that meant and filed it for later. Right now, it meant she had a counter-sniper problem. She reached into her pack and removed a small mirror and a flexible metal rod. Not standard issue, not listed in any equipment manifest. Carried because her father had told her once that the most valuable things you bring into the field are the things nobody thinks to bring. She assembled them into a periscope of sorts, crude but functional, and carefully extended it above the edge of the outcropping. The shooter had moved. She'd expected that. She studied the western ridge through the mirror, reading the terrain the way she had been taught to read it. Not looking for a person, but looking for a disturbance, for the place where the mountain was slightly less itself than everywhere else. She found it, a shadow that didn't move with the wind, a position that offered too clean a sightline to be coincidence. She identified the range, 1,100 yards. The angle was steep. She would be shooting uphill across a ridgeline at a target that had cover on 3 sides. The shot would require her to expose herself for approximately 1.5 seconds. 1.5 seconds is a very short time in most contexts. In this context, it was more than enough. She thought about the mechanics of it. She thought about the wind, which had shifted in the last 20 minutes and was now coming from a slightly different direction. She thought about the elevation correction and the trigger weight and the particular way the Barrett's considerable recoil would affect her follow-through at this angle. She thought about her father's voice. Slow your heart. Find the stillness. That's when you squeeze, not pull. Squeeze. Maya took 3 measured breaths. On the 3rd exhale, she pivoted from behind the outcropping. The Barrett came up, already aligned with the pre-calculated point. Her finger found the trigger. The stillness arrived the way it always did. Not found, but recognized. The body settling into the only moment that mattered. She fired. She was back behind cover before the sound finished echoing. Rourke's voice came through the device, relaying a report from one of his spotters who had been watching the western ridge. Target down, she exhaled. Maya. Rourke's voice carried something she had not heard in it before. Not quite relief, not quite surprise, but a quality of reassessment. That's 31 confirmed. You're keeping us alive up there. Working on 32, she said. She scanned the valley again, taking in the new tactical picture. The ambush had lost its shape. Not broken, not finished, but disrupted enough that the men below had found a defensible position and were holding it. Merritt had been hit, she heard on the radio. Not fatally. The word critical appeared twice in the traffic and then stabilized into serious. 23 men functional. 1 man down, but alive. She was scanning the compound's perimeter when she saw the movement. It was subtle, the kind of movement that registers in peripheral vision before the conscious mind decides what to do with it. A small group leaving the compound's eastern side, not through the main approaches, not in the direction of any fighting. Moving with purpose along a narrow track that ran between two rock formations and disappeared into the tree line, heading deeper into the Blue Ridge terrain. 5 men, armed but not moving like fighters, moving like an escort, and at the center of the group, one man carrying nothing, or rather, carrying one thing. A reinforced metal case, approximately a meter long, handled with a care that had nothing to do with the weight of the object, and everything to do with what was inside it. Maya watched them for 30 seconds, tracking their movement, noting the direction and the pace, and the way the escorts arranged themselves around the case carrier as if he were something fragile and catastrophically important. She keyed the device. Sierra Whiskey to Tiger Team Actual, small group moving east from compound. 5 men, they're carrying something. She paused, watching through the scope. Reinforced case. They're treating it like it's the most important thing on this mountain. Rourke's response came quickly. That's not in the target description. No, she said, it's not. She tracked the group until they reached the tree line and began to lose definition in the darkness. I'm going to follow them, she said. Negative. Rourke's voice was sharp. You are keeping 23 men alive. Do not leave your position. There's something wrong with this whole operation, Captain. She kept her voice level, watching the tree line. No physicist, no hostage rescue, 200 professional fighters who knew exactly where you'd be, Russian-trained counter-sniper, and now 5 men leaving a prepared position was something they are very careful about. She paused. This mission was never what the briefing said it was. A long silence on the frequency. She could hear the valley below her, diminished, controlled, the sound of men holding rather than men dying. She had bought them that. Copy, Rourke said finally. The word cost him something she could hear. Don't lose visual on that case. She secured the Barrett to her pack. She checked her sidearm, a suppressed Sig Sauer P226, chambered and ready. She looked once more down into the valley, at the positions where 23 men were doing what SEAL operators do when everything has gone wrong, which is hold and adapt and survive. The tree line took her in. The operations center at Langley ran on recycled air and fluorescent light, and the particular tension of people watching events they could influence but not control. Deputy Director Theodore Ashford stood before a wall of screens showing thermal imaging of the Blue Ridge terrain. A single moving signature tracked northeast through the tree line, climbing steadily away from the ridge where 31 confirmed kills had been recorded in the last 3 hours. She disabled the tracker, an analyst said. I know, Ashford said. Should we notify? No. Ashford watched the signature move with the unhurried purpose of someone who knows exactly where they're going. Harlan said she'd make this choice. He said she'd make it without being told to. From the back of the room, where the light didn't quite reach, a voice said, she will find him. And when she does, she will have to decide something her father couldn't. Ashford turned. Victor Harlan stood in the shadows with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the screen with an expression that had nothing of calculation in it, and everything of a man watching something irreplaceable walk towards something dangerous. And if she makes the wrong choice? Ashford asked. Harlan was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then I'll have failed Frank twice, he said, and there won't be a third operation to fix it. He did not look away from the screen. The group moved east for 40 minutes, climbing steadily through terrain that was difficult in darkness and would have been manageable in daylight. Maya followed at a distance of approximately 200 yards, close enough to maintain visual contact, far enough that the sounds of her movement could be absorbed by the natural noise of the mountain at night. Wind in the trees, the creek running somewhere below the track, the small, constant percussion of an inhabited wilderness. She had disabled the tracking device in her communications gear before leaving the ridge. She was not certain why she did it. Some instinct older than her training, something that said certain things should not be monitored by certain people. She thought about Harlan standing somewhere she couldn't see, watching a screen that showed her as a blinking dot moving across the Virginia mountains. She thought about what it meant that he had put the Barrett in her gear. She thought about the Eastern Ridge and the specific conversation about it in the briefing, and the way Harlan had deflected the question, and the way his deflection had been technically correct while being fundamentally dishonest, which she now understood was a specific skill that he had been practicing longer than she had been alive. She had been placed precisely. She had been given precisely the right equipment. She had been left precisely the right amount of information to make exactly the decisions she had made. Victor Harlan had spent 15 years preparing her for this mountain, and she was only now beginning to understand the full shape of what he had prepared her for. The group reached a small plateau, roughly flat, sheltered on three sides by rock formations. They set up with practiced efficiency, communications array, satellite uplink equipment, electronic instruments she could identify from 200 yards as radiation detection equipment. The case was placed at the center of the plateau and remained there while Breskov, she could see him clearly now, the build and the movement patterns matching the photographs from Harlan's classified files, worked the communications equipment with the focused attention of a man with a timeline. She found a position in the rocks above the plateau and listened. The words that carried to her across the cold mountain air were in English. Deliberate, she understood. Breshkov spoke for an audience. Device is stable and functional. His voice was accented but precise, shaped by decades of working in languages not his own. Transfer will occur at the designated coordinates, 72 hours. Maya pressed herself into the rock. Manhattan, 72 hours. She thought about numbers. She thought about what fit in a 1-meter reinforced case and was handled with radiation detection equipment and had been worth constructing a 200-man ambush to protect. She thought about Harlan's voice saying the words, portable nuclear device, with the careful precision of someone delivering information they have been holding for 15 years. She keyed the device, kept her voice below a whisper. Sierra Whiskey to Tiger Team Actual. A pause. I have confirmation on the case contents. Nuclear device. Soviet-era design, modern modifications. Yield consistent with a tactical weapon. She stopped. They're planning a transfer. 72 hours. Manhattan. The silence on the other end was the kind that happens when the mind is processing something too large for an immediate response. Copy. Rourke's voice was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Stripped down to something below professionalism, something that lived in the register of a man absorbing a fact he cannot change by absorbing it. Can you secure the device? Not from this position. 5 armed professionals, open terrain. I need to get closer. Understand the transfer logistics before I act. Do not engage until you have a clear opportunity, Rourke said. Maya, the use of her first name was not something he did often. It carried weight when he did. Be careful. She settled into position and watched the plateau below. Breskov finished his transmission. He turned away from the communications array and looked out across the mountain terrain with the expression of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is now in the final hours of waiting for something he has organized his entire life around obtaining. In the light of the equipment screens and the cold autumn stars, his face was the face of someone who has lived entirely inside a single purpose for so long that the purpose and the person have become the same thing. Then, slowly, as if following some instinct of his own, he turned his head and looked directly at the rock formation where Maya was hidden. Not toward it, at it. He spoke into the mountain darkness with the specific calmness of someone who has been waiting for this conversation for a long time. Frank Callaway's daughter, he said, I've been expecting you for 15 years. Maya did not move. She thought about a building in Mogadishu. She thought about a man who had lowered his rifle. She thought about 30 years of two people moving toward the same mountain from opposite directions. She had arrived. The mountain held its breath. Maya did not move. Not a breath, not a shift of weight, not the smallest adjustment of position. She had learned stillness from a man who believed it was the most underrated skill in any operator's inventory, and she held it now with everything she had, pressed into cold rock, the Sig Sauer in her right hand, watching Nikolai Breskov stand in the middle of a plateau in the Virginia mountains and look directly at a darkness that should have been empty. He was not guessing. That was the thing she understood immediately and filed with the cold precision of someone who has been trained to accept facts without arguing with them. He was not estimating. He knew she was there the way you know something you have been waiting for, with the specific quality of recognition rather than discovery. She did not speak. Breskov waited for 10 seconds. Then he smiled, and even at this distance, through the thin mountain starlight, she could see that the smile was not triumphant. It was something older and more complicated than triumph. It was the expression of a man arriving at the end of a very long road and finding it exactly as he expected. "Your father was the finest shot I ever saw," he said. His voice carried easily across the plateau in the cold air. "I say this as someone who has spent considerable time in the company of men who shoot for a living. Frank Callaway was exceptional. I know because I watched him work for 3 months before Mogadishu. I watched him and I prepared for him, and I still barely survived him." He paused. "You have his hands. I assume you have his eyes as well." One of his escorts had raised his weapon toward the rock formation. Breskov held up one hand without looking at the man, and the weapon came down. "I'm not going to ask you to come out," Breskov said. "I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm going to let you decide what you do with it. Because I think you deserve to hear it before this ends, and I think your father deserves someone to tell it to his daughter a long time ago." Maya's breathing was controlled. Her heartbeat was controlled. Everything she could control was controlled. She waited. Somalia, October 1993. Breskov turned back to his communications array, not looking at the rock formation anymore, as if the conversation could happen more honestly without eye contact. "I was there to complete a transaction, certain materials, certain technical knowledge, a buyer who had the resources to make use of both. Standard work for that period. The Soviet Union had collapsed 2 years earlier, and everything that had been locked down under that system was suddenly available to anyone with enough money and enough patience." He adjusted something on the equipment with the habitual hands of a man who has worked with technical devices all his life. "Your father's team had been tracking me for 6 weeks. I knew it. I let them track me because I needed to understand the specific threat before I could neutralize it." He paused. "I had the building wired before I arrived. Every entrance, every sightline, every position a trained shooter might use. All of it connected to a system that required my continued presence to remain inert. Standard KGB doctrine for high-risk meetings. Your father found his position. I watched him through a scope of my own, from a location he didn't know existed, because I had studied the building longer than he had." The wind moved through the plateau. The equipment screens cast pale light across Breskov's face. "He had the shot," Breskov said. "A clean shot. I was exposed for approximately 4 seconds while the buyer arrived. In 4 seconds, your father could have done what he came to do. I would have been dead. The building would have gone with me. 3 members of his team who were positioned inside would have gone with the building." He stopped working the equipment. He made the calculation in less than 1 second. "I watched him make it through the scope. I watched him look at the wiring, look at his team's positions, look at his sights, and lower his rifle." Maya's grip on the Sig Sauer had not changed. Everything about her exterior had not changed. Somewhere underneath the exterior, something was happening that had no name yet. "He transmitted a warning to his team instead of taking the shot," Breskov continued. "The transmission exposed his position. My security found him in 4 seconds and opened fire. He provided covering fire until his team reached safety. A pause that had genuine weight in it. He was a professional to the end. I respected that then. I respect it now. He finally turned back toward the rock formation. Victor Harlan told you your father failed his mission, he said. He told you Frank Callaway chose 3 men over 8 million, and that choice was a weakness, and that weakness is why I am still alive today. He looked directly at the darkness. What Harlan did not tell you is that the meeting I was attending in that building was a preliminary conversation. The materials were not present. The transaction was 4 weeks from completion when your father found me. If he had taken that shot and died, and taken his team with him, he would have killed 4 people and delayed nothing. He let that sit for a moment. I know this because Harlan knew this. The intelligence was wrong, or it was shaped to be wrong. And a man of Harlan's experience does not make that kind of error by accident. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of things. Maya came out from behind the rock formation. She moved onto the plateau with the Sig Sauer raised, and her eyes taking in the 5 escorts, in the positions, in the distance to the case, in the continuous tactical calculation that had been running underneath everything else since she left the ridge. The escorts tracked her. Breskov made no signal to them. "Keep talking," she said. He looked at her with something that might, in a different life, have been called respect. Harlan needed a reason to continue pursuing me. A failed mission was that reason. A fallen operator's daughter, trained from childhood to finish what her father started. That was the mechanism. You were not recruited, Maya Callaway. You were manufactured. From the day Harlan stood at your mother's door in his dress uniform, he was already building the next operation. She kept the weapon level. Her eyes moved between Breskov and his escorts in the steady rhythm of someone managing a room. "The device," she said. "Yes," he nodded toward the case. "Genuine, functional, an RA-115, recovered from a facility outside Minsk in 1994 through channels I will not detail. It has taken me 20 years to bring it to a point of usability." He looked at her steadily. "It was never intended for Manhattan. I heard your transmission. You heard what I said on an open satellite channel that I was aware was being monitored by at least 3 intelligence services." The ghost of something moved across his face. Manhattan was a message, a way of forcing Harlan's hand. He has been hunting me for 30 years. I am tired of being hunted. I wanted him in the field himself, not running assets from a comfortable chair in Virginia. He paused. "I wanted him to send you." Maya held very still. "Because I wanted you to hear what I just told you," he said, "before it ends. Whatever ending you choose." He reached inside his jacket with 2 fingers, slowly, and produced a small device, rectangular, black, the size of a television remote. He held it up so she could see it clearly. "Dead man's mechanism," he said. "The case is armed. If my heart stops, the device initiates a 15-second countdown." He held her gaze. "Kill me and you have 15 seconds to move everyone in this valley out of the blast radius. That includes the 23 men you've been keeping alive for the last 3 hours." He lowered his hand but kept the device visible. "Or you let me leave with the case, and I disappear again, and in 6 months or 6 years, Harlan sends someone else after me, and we begin the whole procedure again." Maya looked at him. She looked at the device. She looked at the case. She thought about 23 men in a ravine below this plateau, holding defensive positions, waiting for dawn that was now less than 2 hours away. She thought about Merritt with a collapsed lung being kept alive by a teammate with field medical training. She thought about her father standing in a building in Mogadishu with a clean shot and a piece of information that changed the calculation entirely. She thought about what it meant to choose. Breskov began moving toward the edge of the plateau where the terrain dropped toward a secondary track. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her time to decide. "Your father was a better man than the mission required," he said, almost gently. That is the only honest thing Harlan ever said about him, and he said it as a criticism. He reached the edge. I am sorry for what happened to him. I have been sorry for 30 years. It changes nothing, but it is true. He was at the rope ladder now, the sound of a helicopter audible somewhere above. She had not heard it approach, had been too focused on the plateau, and that was a failure she noted and filed. The helicopter was holding position above the cloud layer, waiting. She had the shot, clean, unobstructed. At this range, with this weapon, there was no margin for error in either direction, neither hers nor his. She held the Sig Sauer level and looked at Nikolai Breskov across 15 feet of cold mountain air and thought about 15 seconds and 23 men and the distance between a principle and its consequences. Then a single shot came from the western approach to the plateau. The sound arrived a fraction of a second after the effect. Breskov's body jerked once, sharply, his head snapping back with the specific violence of a high-velocity round striking bone. He was dead before his grip on the rope ladder failed. He fell without the particular quality of a body that still contains a person. The device dropped from his hand and skittered across the rock. Nothing happened. The case sat in the center of the plateau, inert and silent, and approximately the most dangerous object in the state of Virginia. Maya spun toward the western approach, weapon raised, and found Victor Harlan walking out of the darkness with a sniper rifle slung across his back and the specific, unhurried pace of a man who has arrived precisely when he intended to arrive. His escorts, she counted 2, in positions she had not detected, which told her something about how long they had been there, remained in the shadows at the plateau's edge. The helicopter above began its descent. Breskov's 5 escorts had scattered into the terrain at the shot, either from training or from the particular calculation of men who understand when a situation has changed ownership. Harlan walked to the device, picked it up, examined it with the brief attention of someone confirming something they already knew. He set it down. Dead Man's Switch is theater, he said. His voice was the same as always. Level, carrying exactly as much as it needed to and nothing more. KGB developed the protocol in 1979 for precisely this kind of confrontation. Create an impossible choice. Paralyze your opponent. I wrote the counter doctrine in 1983. He looked at her. I was not going to let you stand here indefinitely while Breskov finished his speech. Maya had not lowered the Sig Sauer. It was pointed at the ground now, but it was in her hand, and the hand had not relaxed. How long have you been on this mountain? She said. Since before your team deployed. He moved to the case and checked its external indicators with practiced hands. Not the hands of someone learning, but the hands of someone confirming a known status. I inserted 48 hours ago with a 2-man advance element. The eastern ridge was your approach. The western ridge was mine. You were watching me the entire time. I was ensuring the operation succeeded. He looked up from the case. You performed beyond every projection. 31 confirmed kills from a position you reached alone in darkness, followed by a successful track and intercept of the primary target. Something moved in his eyes that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Frank would have been, don't. The word came out quiet and absolute. She looked at him across the plateau. Tell me the rest of it. What Breskov said about the intelligence, about what was really in that building in Mogadishu. The helicopter had landed at the plateau's edge. Harlan's 2 escorts moved toward the case. He held up one hand and they stopped. He looked at Maya for a long moment. In 67 years, Victor Harlan had told very few complete truths. He had told partial truths, shaped truths, truths deployed strategically to produce specific outcomes. He had been very good at it for a very long time. He looked at Frank Callaway's daughter, standing on a mountain in Virginia at 4 in the morning with blood on her cheek and a weapon in her hand, and he made a calculation of a kind he did not make often. The intelligence was incomplete, he said. We knew Breskov was meeting with a potential buyer. We did not have confirmation that the materials would be present at that meeting. The assessment, my assessment, was that the probability was high enough to justify the operation. He held her gaze. I was wrong. The materials were not there. Frank died for a preliminary conversation. The mountain was very quiet. You knew this afterward, she said. It was not a question. Within 72 hours of the operation, when our assets were able to reconstruct what had been present at the meeting, he paused. Yes. And you built the next 25 years on the version where he failed. Harlan was quiet for a moment. I built the next 25 years on the version where the mission mattered, where what happened to Frank had a purpose larger than a preliminary transaction. His voice carried the weight of someone who has justified a thing so many times that the justification and the thing have become indistinguishable. Breskov was real. The threat was real. What we stopped tonight was real. By using 24 men who didn't know they were bait, by using me as a weapon you'd been building since I was 10 years old. She looked at him steadily. By letting my father be remembered as the man who couldn't finish the job. Your father's record has been, his record is a file in a classified system that nobody reads. Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. His daughter grew up knowing he died failing a mission. That is what you built. That is what you used. Harlan received this the way he received most things, without visible damage to the exterior. But she had known him long enough to read what lived underneath the exterior, and what lived there now was something she had never seen in him before. Not regret exactly, something older and less forgiving than regret. The look of a man who has arrived at the end of a very long accounting and found the numbers do not balance. The device is secured, he said finally. Breskov is eliminated. The threat to Manhattan, genuine, regardless of how he framed his transmission, is neutralized. He straightened. The military bearing was automatic, decades deep. That is what tonight was. That is part of what tonight was, she said. She reached into her gear and removed the encrypted storage device she had loaded at the communications station before leaving. Quietly, in the 40 minutes before she went to the Eastern Ridge, working through Harlan's own security protocols with the access codes he had given her as her commanding officer. The irony of that was not lost on her. She held it up so he could see it. Everything, she said. Operation Watchbreaker. The actual intelligence assessment from October 1993. Your operational plan for Crossfire and the real objectives versus the briefed objectives. The communications logs between you and Langley going back 6 months. She held his gaze. All of it. Something changed in Harlan's face. Not breaking, the face did not break, but a very small, very old adjustment, as if something load-bearing had shifted a fraction of an inch and the whole structure had to compensate. That information is classified above. These men deserve to know what they bled for tonight. She held the device steady. Merritt is lying in a valley below this mountain with a collapsed lung. He is 35 years old. He has a wife in San Diego and 2 daughters who are 7 and 4. He was told he was going into those mountains to rescue a physicist who does not exist. Her voice remained level throughout all of this, which was the hardest thing she had done in a night full of hard things. He deserves the truth. They all do. Harlan looked at the device for a long time. Then he said, "What do you intend to do with it?" "Give it to Captain Rourke." She held the device steady. "He will know what to do with it. He has known you for 30 years, which means he understands both what you did and why. And he will find a way to ensure accountability that does not compromise what was actually accomplished tonight." She paused. "That is the best offer you will receive." The helicopter's rotors continued their patient revolution. Somewhere below, in the valley, the sounds of combat had stopped. Dawn was coming. She could feel it in the quality of the darkness, that specific shift in the air that happens in the last hour before first light. Harlan looked at her for a long time. The expression on his face was not one she had a name for. It was not anger. It was not calculation. It was something that had been waiting a very long time to surface and was now, very quietly, doing so. Your father lowered his rifle because he could not accept that the people beside him were acceptable losses, he said. I spent 25 years believing that was his flaw. A pause. I am no longer certain I was right about that. He stepped back. He turned to his escorts and said a single word that sent them both to the helicopter. He looked at the case, at the device she was holding, at the plateau where Breskov's body lay at the edge of the light. The CIA extraction team will take custody of the case, he said. I will manage the official reporting. He looked at her one final time, not as a commanding officer, not as a handler, not as the architect of a 25-year operation that had just concluded in a way he had not precisely planned. Something simpler than any of those things, and harder. You have Frank's judgment as well as his hands. I should have expected that. He walked to the helicopter without looking back. Rourke came up the mountain as the first gray light was finding the ridgelines. He came alone, which told her something about the state of his team, that he could leave them and they would hold, which meant the immediate crisis had stabilized. He moved with the careful efficiency of a man running on the last available reserves, every motion stripped down to what was absolutely necessary. There was blood on his jacket that was not all his own. He stood at the edge of the plateau and took in the scene. The case, the body, the helicopter tracks in the frost, the communications array that was still running on whatever Breskov's team had powered it with. He looked at Maya for a long moment. Merritt, she said. Alive. They're getting him out now. He looked at the case. Is it secure, inert? Harlan's people have the technical team coming in. She held up the storage device. This is the rest of it. He took it from her hand. He looked at it, then at her. How bad? Bad enough that the men who were in that valley tonight deserved to be told the truth before they went in. She held his gaze. And bad enough that my father's record deserves to be corrected, officially, permanently. Rourke turned the device over in his hand once. He had the look of a man who has suspected something for a long time and is now holding the confirmation of it and is deciding in real time whether confirmation is better or worse than suspicion. After a moment, he put the device in his jacket. I know a JAG officer, he said, 20 years in. The right clearances. He helped clean up the reporting after an operation in '94 that Harlan ran in a way that required some cleaning. He looked at her steadily. He believes in the system, not in protecting it from the truth, but in using it to process the truth properly. That's enough, she said. The light was genuinely arriving now, finding the rock faces in the tree line and the frost on the plateau in that first cold gold that the mountains produce on clear autumn mornings. Below them, the valley was emerging from darkness. The positions where 23 men had held through the night, the ravine where they had consolidated, the compound that had been filled with professionals executing a mission that was never what it was briefed to be. Harlan built this entire operation to finish what my father started, she said, and Breskov built his entire operation to force Harlan into the open. She looked out across the mountains. 30 years of two men pointing at each other across a very large distance. And you in the middle, Rourke said. Not anymore. He was quiet for a moment. The morning was coming in fully now, the way Virginia mornings come in autumn, without apology, filling the world with a clarity that makes the night's events look like something that happened in a different country. There's a position opening on my team, he said. Scout sniper, communications cross-training, formal assignment, proper paperwork, full disclosure of skills to the people you'll be working with. He looked at her. No hidden files, no manufactured cover stories, no equipment appearing in your gear without explanation. She looked at him. After everything that happened tonight, you'd want me on your team. Tonight is why I want you on my team. His voice was straightforward in the way of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to dress it up. 31 confirmed kills from an unsupported position you reached alone in darkness. Track and intercept on a primary target under direct threat. And when you had the choice between completing the mission Harlan designed and doing the right thing, he stopped. You already know what choice you made. She looked out across the valley one more time. She thought about her father on a different mountain, in a different country, making a different choice that someone had spent 25 years calling a failure. She thought about what it meant to inherit a legacy, not the version that had been shaped and classified and deployed as a tool, but the actual version, the real one, the one that lived in the hands of a man who lowered his rifle because he could not make the people beside him into arithmetic. Yes, she said. Rourke nodded once. He started back down the mountain. She fell in beside him. 6 months later, the maple trees around Arlington National Cemetery were in full color, red and gold against a sky that had gone the specific deep blue of late October, the kind of blue that only appears at this latitude in this season, as if the sky is making a particular effort on behalf of the occasion. Maya stood before her father's grave in the middle of a Tuesday morning with no ceremony, no official presence, no one watching. The new marker had been in place for 3 weeks, the result of a review process that had been quiet and thorough and had concluded with a finding that the classification and characterization of Chief Petty Officer Frank Callaway's final action in Operation Watchbreaker did not accurately reflect the events of October 1993. The new inscription was not long. It did not need to be. Chief Petty Officer Frank Callaway, United States Navy, Navy Cross. He never left anyone behind. She stood there for a while in the October morning, letting the silence be what it was. She was not someone who talked to graves. She did not believe the dead heard anything. But she believed that standing in front of a correct statement about a person who had mattered was its own kind of act, and she was willing to perform it. She heard footsteps and knew them before she turned. Rourke stopped beside her with the quiet respect of someone entering another person's moment without crowding it. Merritt is back on limited duty as of this week, he said. Physical therapy twice a week, but he's running 3 miles. His daughters called the team when he crossed the finish line. A brief pause. He wanted me to tell you something. She waited. He said, I didn't understand what I was fighting for that night, but I know who kept me alive long enough to find out. She looked at the inscription for another moment. The words were plain and permanent and exactly right. The review board's finding gets entered into the permanent record next week, Rourke said. Full Navy Cross citation, unredacted. Your mother will receive the formal notification. Maya nodded. There were things she would feel about that later, in private, in whatever space she kept for the feelings that didn't have operational relevance. Right now, she let it be a fact and moved forward. Geneva, she said. Rourke reached into his jacket and removed a photograph. Surveillance camera, private banking district taken 4 days ago. A man in an expensive suit with military posture that no amount of tailoring could entirely conceal. Beside him, a second man she did not recognize, but whose file she had reviewed twice since Rourke had briefed her on the intelligence. Dr. Emery Voss, former Soviet weapons systems analyst, officially deceased since 1995, apparently in excellent health. Harlan is supposed to be in an advisory capacity, Rourke said. No field operations. Harlan has been planning his next operation since before this one ended, Maya said. She looked at the photograph for a moment, then handed it back. He sent me my father's trident. I know. No signature, just a note. She looked back at the grave. He's not asking permission. He's telling me the game continues and he expects me to continue it with him. On his terms, the way I always have. And? She turned from the grave. The October light was doing what October light does in Virginia, finding every surface and making it briefly, specifically beautiful before the season moved on. I'll continue the work, she said. My terms, my team, my read on what's worth doing and what crosses the line. She started walking toward the cemetery's main path. When do we brief? Tomorrow, 0800, Quantico. He fell in beside her. We're calling it Operation Silent Sentinel. She considered the name. A watcher in the shadows. A guardian who acts before anyone knows the threat exists. One condition, she said. Name it. Every operator who comes onto this goes in knowing the real mission. No shaped intelligence. No compartmentalized objectives they don't have need to know on. She looked at him. They fight knowing what they're fighting for. Every time. Rourke was quiet for a few steps. Harlan would say that's operationally naive. Harlan would be wrong. She looked ahead through the rows of white markers stretching to the tree line. My father knew exactly what he was fighting for in that building in Mogadishu. He made his choice with his eyes open. He saw the wiring. He saw his team. He chose. She paused. That's not weakness. That's the whole point. They walked out of Arlington in the October morning, and the trees were red and gold overhead. And somewhere in a banking district in Geneva, Victor Harlan was building the next thing. And somewhere in a cleared facility in Quantico, a new operation was waiting to be understood. And the work was not finished, had never been finished, would not be finished in any lifetime she could see from here. But it was hers now, not Harlan's design, not her father's unfinished mission, not the weapon a 67-year-old man had spent 25 years manufacturing in the space left by grief and guilt, and the particular stubbornness of someone who could not accept that the most important things are sometimes the ones that cannot be calculated. Hers. The silent sentinel moves before anyone knows the threat exists. She watches from positions no one thinks to watch. She acts with precision, with purpose, with the specific kind of commitment that comes not from being built for something, but from choosing it. Maya Callaway walked out of Arlington National Cemetery on a Tuesday in October and chose it.